The Arizona Territory, 1873. First light revealed their broken bodies, a mother and two small boys chained to an overturned wagon wheel, abandoned at the edge of the painted desert. Buzzards circled overhead, waiting. When the Apache appeared, his face weathered like the surrounding mesas. The woman clutched her children closer. He stood motionless, obsidian eyes reflecting the rising sun. Without a word, he broke their chains, using only his hands. One by one, he lifted them onto his painted mustang. First the smallest boy, then his brother, finally the reluctant mother. What could drive a warrior to risk everything for the very people his tribe had been fighting for generations before? We jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Holcomb's cracked lips bled as she whispered prayers into her youngest son's hair. 5-year-old Eli trembled against her chest, his small frame burning with fever. 8-year-old Thomas sat beside them, his eyes never leaving the Apache who had freed them from their chains, but might still, in the boy's mind, be leading them to a fate worse than death. The overturned wagon behind them had once carried everything they owned. James had been so certain about Oregon, a new beginning after the bank took their Missouri farm. Out west, a man can still make something of himself, he'd promised. Now James lay buried beneath a crude rock pile 2 days back, his skull caved, in by the same bandits who'd taken their oxen, supplies, and hope. "Mama, where's he taking us?" Thomas whispered, nodding toward their silent guide. "I don't know," Sarah answered, her voice barely audible. 3 days chained to that wagon wheel had left her throat parched despite the small amount of water the Apache had shared. She studied the warrior's broad back as he led the painted mustang across the scrubland. His long hair hung in 2 braids, wrapped with strips of red cloth. A knife and what looked like a medicine pouch hung from his belt, but he carried no gun. That she could see, the bandits had been white men, not Apache. She remembered their leader's yellowed teeth as he laughed, chaining them to the wagon wheel. "Might be some Indians find you first," he'd said. "Might be the sun gets you. Either way, you'll feed something out here." On the 3rd day, as Eli's fever had risen and her own hope had faded, the Apache had appeared like a mirage against the heat waves. Sarah had been certain he was death come to claim them. Instead, he'd broken their chains. As darkness fell across the desert, the warrior stopped beside a stand of cottonwoods. A small seep of water created a muddy pool, barely large enough to fill his cupped hands. He helped them dismount, his touch impersonal but gentle as he lifted each child down. When his hands circled Sarah's waist, she flinched involuntarily. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but recognition of her fear. He built a small fire, producing dried meat from his pouch. Thomas accepted his portion eagerly, but Eli was too weak to chew. Sarah softened bits in her mouth before feeding them to her youngest. The Apache watched this with unreadable eyes before gathering more water in a small hide container and mixing it with something from his medicine bundle. When he offered this to Eli, Sarah pulled her son away. "No," she said, the first word she'd spoken directly to him. The warrior didn't insist. He placed the mixture near them and moved to the edge of the firelight where he sat cross-legged, back straight as a cavalry officer's. Minutes passed in silence while Eli whimpered against her. The fever was getting worse. Thomas picked up the hide cup, sniffing its contents. "Smells like the tea Mrs. Fredericks made when I had the croup," he said. Sarah hesitated, torn between fear of the unknown medicine and fear for her son's life. She recalled stories from back east, children stolen by Indians, women taken as slaves or worse, but this man had broken their chains when he could have simply slit their throats. Why? When Eli's small body convulsed with chills, she made her decision. She lifted the cup to her son's lips, helping him drink the bitter mixture while watching the Apache's impassive face across the flames. That night, as her sons finally slept, Sarah kept vigil. The warrior seemed to neither sleep nor move, his silhouette a dark sentinel against the star-filled sky. She clutched the small knife she'd hidden in her skirts, the one thing the bandits hadn't found, and wondered what dawn would bring. Beishiji had not spoken a word in 7 winters. The eagle spirit had taken his voice the day he found his wife and daughter slaughtered by blue coats at Skeleton Canyon. Their blood had soaked into the earth, and with it, his words had sunk away, buried too deep to recover. His people called him Beishi, he who carries, not just for his strength in battle, but for how he carried the burdens of others in silence. The elders respected him. The warriors gave him distance. A man who did not speak was touched by spirits. Some feared him, others sought his blessing. He touched the eagle feather medicine bundle hanging from his neck. 3 days ago, while meditating, on Eagle Rock, he had received the vision, 3 souls chained to a broken wheel, their spirits flickering like dying campfires. The eagle had circled above them in his vision, crying out in a voice that pierced his heart. Carry them, the eagle had commanded, as you carry your own grief. So he had mounted his mustang and ridden northeast, following the eagle's path across the sky. When he found them, the woman and her 2 sons, he understood. Their suffering mirrored his own. The woman's eyes held the same emptiness he had carried since Skeleton Canyon. Now, watching her across the small fire, he recognized her fear. She clutched the small knife beneath her skirt, thinking he couldn't see. The white woman's distrust was natural. His people and hers had shed each other's blood for generations. But the eagle had not spoken of blood, only of carrying. The younger boy's fever had broken sometime in the night. The medicine was working. Beishi nodded to himself, satisfied. The older boy watched him with curious eyes rather than fear. Children often saw more clearly than their elders. His own son would have been this age. The thought came unbidden, bringing with it a wave of grief that he allowed to wash through him without resistance. His medicine teacher had shown him how to let sorrow flow like water rather than dam it up until it drowned the spirit. Before dawn, Beishi rose and walked to the edge of their small camp. He faced east, raising his arms to greet the sun. The eagle appeared as if summoned, circling overhead before landing on a nearby rock. Man and bird regarded each other in the growing light. They are white people. Beishi's thoughts challenged the eagle. Their kind killed my family. The eagle's dark eyes reflected the first rays of sunlight. In them, Beishi saw no division between peoples, only souls in need of carrying. Understanding will come, the eagle seemed to say. First, there must be trust. When he returned to camp, the woman was awake, watching him. Her hand no longer hovered near her hidden knife. The small one, Eli she had called him, slept peacefully, his fever visibly reduced. The older boy, Thomas, stirred and sat up. "Where did you go?" the boy asked. Beishi pointed to the east, then to the sky, then placed his hand over his heart. The boy nodded, as if understanding perfectly. They would need water for the journey ahead. Many miles of hard country lay between them and the hidden valley where his mother's sister still lived. The old medicine woman would know what to do with these 3 lost souls. As Beishi packed his few belongings and prepared the mustang, he felt the woman's eyes on him. Her fear remained, but something else had begun to grow alongside it. The first fragile seed of trust. It was enough for now. The eagle circled overhead as they set out, leading them westward into the rising sun. By midday, the sun beat down upon them like a blacksmith's hammer. Sarah's lips had cracked again, and Thomas's fair skin had turned an angry red, despite the cloth Beishi had given him to drape over his head. Only Eli seemed improved, his fever having broken during the night. The Apache warrior stopped his mustang beside a flat rock. From his saddlebag, he produced a clay water gourd decorated with intricate patterns of red and black. He dismounted and helped them down, his movements efficient but gentle. Sarah watched as he uncorked the gourd and offered it first to Eli, then Thomas. When he extended it to her, their fingers brushed briefly. His hand was calloused but warm. She drank sparingly, the water tasting of minerals and earth. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Was she truly thanking? "An Apache?" He acknowledged her with the slightest nod before taking a single swallow himself. Sarah marveled at his restraint. Her husband, James, would have emptied half the gourd, claiming a man needed more water than a woman or child. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked the warrior. When he received no answer, the boy turned to Sarah. "Why doesn't he talk, Mama?" "I don't know," she replied softly. "Perhaps he doesn't speak English." Beishia's eyes flickered to her face, and she had the distinct impression he understood every word. Thomas, always curious, approached the warrior and pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said clearly. Then he pointed to his brother, Eli. Finally, he gestured to Sarah. "Mama, Sarah." The Apache touched his own chest and made a series of sounds Sarah couldn't hope to pronounce. Thomas tried anyway, mangling the syllables, until the warrior's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Almost a smile. Eli, now fully awake, scrambled down from the rock where he'd been sitting. "I'm hungry," he announced. Sarah winced at the demand, but the warrior was already reaching into his pouch. He produced several strips of dried meat and what appeared to be pounded nuts mixed with berries. As they ate, Sarah found herself studying the Apache's profile against the harsh landscape. His face bore none of the savagery depicted in the penny dreadfuls that had circulated back east. There was a quietude to him that reminded her of her father, a man of few words but deep thoughts. "My husband," she said suddenly, not sure why she was speaking. "James, he was killed by white men, not Apache." She touched her wedding ring, a simple gold band now too loose on her thin finger. "He was taking us to Oregon." The warrior gave. No indication he understood, but his dark eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. When they resumed their journey, he placed Thomas in front of him on the horse and helped Sarah mount behind, with Eli secured in her arms. The closeness was unsettling. She could feel the heat of the Apache's back against her chest, smell the unfamiliar scent of smoke and herbs that clung to his buckskin shirt. As the afternoon wore on, the desert gave way to scattered juniper and pinon. Eli fell asleep in her arms, his small body finally relaxed. Sarah found her own eyelids growing heavy, the rhythmic motion of the horse lulling her despite her determination to remain alert. In a moment of weakness, her head drooped forward, coming to rest against the warrior's shoulder. She jerked awake instantly, mortified, but he gave no sign of noticing. Ahead, the land rose toward distant mountains, blue and hazy in the afternoon light. "Are we going there?" Thomas asked, pointing. The Apache nodded once, and Sarah wondered what waited for them beyond those distant peaks. By late afternoon of the third day, they reached what appeared to be a dry riverbed. Sarah eyed the cracked earth and scattered stones with relief, an easy crossing. But Beishi halted the mustang, his posture suddenly alert. He dismounted and helped them down, then walked to the center of the wash, kneeling to press his ear against the ground. "What's he doing, Mama?" Eli whispered. Before Sarah could answer, Beishi returned and began unloading their few possessions from the horse. He pointed upstream, his expression grave. Sarah followed his gaze, but saw only blue sky and canyon walls. Thomas, who had been watching the Apache intently, tugged at her skirt. "I think there's a flood coming," he said. As if summoned by the boy's words, a distant rumble reached them. Beishi quickly led them to higher ground, where several ancient stones had been arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be natural. The crossing stones were weathered and half-buried, like sentinels forgotten by time. They reached the outcropping just as a wall of brown water surged around the bend, carrying uprooted trees and debris. Sarah clutched her sons, watching in horror as the dry wash transformed into a raging torrent that would have swept them away had they been caught in its path. "How did he know?" she whispered, looking at the warrior with new respect. The flash flood forced them to make camp on the high ground. As darkness fell, they huddled near a small fire, listening to the water's continued roar. The crossing stones formed a semicircle around them, like a protective embrace from those who had passed this way before. "My pa said Indians can hear things." "White folks can't," Thomas said, watching Beshi sharpen his knife on a smooth stone. "Is that true?" The warrior paused, then set down his knife and placed his palm flat against the earth. He motioned for Thomas to do the same. The boy complied eagerly, pressing his small hand to the ground and closing his eyes in concentration. "I feel it," Thomas exclaimed after a moment, "like a big heart beating." Beshi nodded, something like approval flickering across his stoic features. Sarah, watching this exchange, felt a strange tightness in her chest. James would have scoffed at such a lesson, calling it savage superstition. Yet there was wisdom in it, wisdom that had saved their lives. By morning the flood had receded, leaving a changed landscape. The crossing that had appeared simple was now revealed as treacherous, a deep channel cut through its center, still flowing swiftly with muddy water. Beji studied the obstacle, then began removing his moccasins and knife. Sarah realized with a jolt what he intended. "No," she protested. "We'll find another way." He shook his head firmly, pointing to the distant mountains, then to the sun climbing higher. They couldn't afford delay. With grim efficiency, he wrapped a rope around his waist, secured the other end to the mustang, and waded into the water. The current immediately grabbed at him, but he fought his way across, using the crossing stones as anchors where he could find them. On the far bank, he secured the rope to a boulder, creating a lifeline across the channel. Sarah watched, heart in her throat, as he returned for them. He carried Eli first, the small boy clinging to his neck like a monkey. Thomas followed, showing surprising courage as he held tight to the warrior's back. Finally, it was Sarah's turn. "I can manage with the rope," she insisted. Beshi regarded her silently, then extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. The water was ice-cold and violent, pulling at her skirts and threatening to tear her from the Apache's grasp. Halfway across, her foot slipped and she plunged beneath the surface. Strong arms encircled her waist immediately, lifting her up. She emerged, sputtering, clinging instinctively to the warrior's solid form. When they reached the far bank, Sarah found herself unable to look away from his face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for the life debt she now owed him. They remained at the sacred spring for 2 days, allowing Eli to fully recover and their own strength to return. During this time, something shifted between them, a bridge built without words. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sarah awoke to find Beshi sitting cross-legged near the spring, a slender piece of wood in his hands. As she approached, she saw that it was smoothly polished, with feathers and small stones attached to one end. Thomas, already awake and watching the warrior, whispered, "It's a talking stick. My teacher in Missouri told us Indians use them in councils." Beshi nodded approvingly at the boy. He held the stick out to Thomas, who took it reverently. "What do I do with it?" he asked. The Apache pointed to his lips, then made a sweeping gesture with his hand. He pointed to the stick, then to Thomas, then to himself. "I think whoever holds the stick gets to talk," Thomas guessed. Beshi inclined his head. "But you don't talk," Eli pointed out, having wandered over to join them. The warrior's eyes crinkled slightly, that almost smile Sarah had come to recognize. He took the stick back, held it, and then deliberately gestured to the spring, the sky, and finally placed his hand over his heart. "You're speaking without words," Sarah said quietly. He looked at her, something warming in his dark eyes, and nodded. Thus began their silent language. The talking stick passed between them throughout the day. When Thomas held it, he asked endless questions that Beshi answered with increasingly elaborate gestures. When Eli took his turn, he mostly told stories about his favorite things back in Missouri, watching the warrior's face for reactions. When the stick came to Sarah, she found herself speaking of things she rarely discussed. her childhood in Kentucky, her grandmother's stories, her dreams before she had married James. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted, the talking stick smooth in her hands. "But then I met James, and he said a wife's place was in the home." Beshi listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When she passed him the stick, he pointed to her, made a teaching gesture, then pointed to Thomas and Eli. She was still teaching, he seemed to say, even without a schoolhouse. By afternoon, they had developed a rudimentary sign language. Thomas proved remarkably adept, often interpreting between his mother and the Apache. Beshi taught them basic Apache signs: water, food, danger, friend, and learned their English words in return. "Why don't you speak?" Thomas finally asked, when the talking stick came to him again. "Can you?" Beshi was still for a long moment. Then he took the stick and pointed to his throat, clenched his fist tightly, and made a gesture like something being buried deep in the earth. "Your words are buried," Sarah said softly, "because of something painful." His eyes met hers, and she saw the confirmation there, along with something else, a flicker of surprise at being understood. That evening, as they prepared to continue their journey the next day, Beshi presented Thomas with the completed wooden horse. The boy's face lit up as he traced the detailed mane and the carefully carved saddle. "It's perfect," Thomas breathed. "Thank you." He tried to form the Apache word for thanks that Beshi had taught him, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. The warrior nodded gravely, but pleasure showed in his eyes. Later, as the children slept, Sarah found Beshi sitting by the spring. Without the talking stick, she felt momentarily uncertain, but he motioned for her to join him. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars reflect in the still water. After a time, Sarah spoke quietly. "My husband would have said I was foolish to trust you." She looked at the warrior's profile, strong and dignified in the moonlight. He saw the world very simply: white and Indian, civilized and savage. She hesitated. "I think perhaps he was wrong about many things." Beshi turned to her, his expression solemn. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and gently touched the corner of her eye where a tear had formed without her noticing. In that moment, with no word spoken, Sarah felt more truly seen than she had in all her years of marriage. They left the sacred spring at dawn, climbing higher into the mountains. By midday, they entered a narrow canyon where towering walls of red sandstone blocked the harsh sun. Cool shadows wrapped around them like a blessing after days of relentless heat. "Look, Mama," Eli pointed upward, his voice echoing slightly. "Pictures on the rocks." Sarah followed his gaze. High on the canyon walls, ancient images spread across the stone surface, handprints, spiraling patterns, and figures both human and animal. Some had faded to mere whispers against the red rock, while others remained vivid despite the passage of centuries. Beshi dismounted, helping them down. He led them to a section of wall where the pictographs told what seemed to be a story. He pointed to two distinct groups of human figures standing together, neither raising weapons against the other. "Are those Apache and white people?" Thomas asked, squinting up at the faded images. Beshi shook his head. He made gestures indicating many different peoples, then pointed to the peaceful scene again. "Different tribes living in peace," Sarah translated. "Before the white men came?" The warrior nodded, then pointed to another section, showing what appeared to be a shared hunt, with figures of different sizes and shapes pursuing deer together. "They helped each other," Eli said, understanding despite his young age. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Sarah noticed Beshi growing increasingly alert, his eyes scanning the rim above them. When they reached a bend in the narrow passage, he suddenly raised his hand for silence, his head tilted in a listening posture. Sarah strained her ears, but heard nothing beyond the soft whisper of wind through the canyon. Then, faintly, the sound of voices, English voices. Beshi moved with swift efficiency, leading them to a crevice in the canyon wall, partially hidden by brush. He motioned for them to enter what turned out to be a shallow cave. Inside, cool darkness enveloped them, the air smelling of dust and sage. "Stay," he signed clearly before slipping back outside. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She pulled her sons close, straining to hear. The voices grew louder, men's voices, rough with fatigue and frustration. Waste of time. They're long dead by now. Captain's orders. We keep searching till we find their bodies, or what's left of them after the Apaches finished. Sarah's breath caught. They were looking for her family. What if they're still alive? A younger voice, uncertain, a harsh laugh, answered him. Then they're wishing they weren't. You know what those savages do to white women. Thomas looked up at his mother, confusion in his eyes. Those are our people, he whispered. Shouldn't we call to them? Sarah hesitated, the question striking deeper than her son could know. Were those men truly her people anymore? After Apache had saved them, fed them, carried them to safety, while these soldiers had been days behind, and what would happen to the Apache if she revealed their presence? Before she could answer, Eli spoke up firmly. "Apache told us to stay hidden." The voices grew fainter as the patrol moved up the canyon. Minutes stretched like hours until finally Apache returned, his expression grave. He motioned for them to remain in the cave a while longer. In the dim light filtering through the crevice, Sarah studied the pictographs that adorned even this hidden space. One series of images showed people taking shelter in a sacred place while danger passed outside, just as they were doing now. "These pictures," she said softly, "they're like stories passed down, aren't they? Teaching those who come after." Apache nodded, settling cross-legged near the entrance to keep watch. He picked up a small stone and began tracing in the dust of the cave floor. Sarah moved closer to see what he was drawing. A simple image took shape. A woman and 2 children, accompanied by a solitary warrior. Above them, an eagle spread its wings protectively. "Is that us?" Thomas asked, peering over his mother's shoulder. The Apache nodded, adding a few more lines to complete the eagle. "Are you making our story part of your people's stories?" Sarah asked, something tightening in her chest at the thought. Apache looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the faint light from the crevice. He pointed to the pictographs on the wall, then to his drawing, then placed his hand over his heart. "Some stories," he seemed to say, "are too important to leave untold, even if they must be written in silence." They remained in the hidden cave until sunset, waiting for any sign that the soldiers had doubled back. When Apache finally led them out, the canyon was painted in deep purples and golds, the pictographs seeming to shift and breathe in the changing light. "Are we safe now?" Eli asked, clutching his wooden doll as they mounted the patient mustang. Apache nodded, though his vigilant posture suggested safety was never certain in these contested lands. They traveled until full dark, making camp in a small clearing ringed by juniper trees. Their supplies were running low, the last of the dried meat gone that morning. Sarah watched as Apache assembled a simple bow from materials in his pack, testing its flexibility with strong, sure hands. "He's going hunting," Thomas whispered, excitement in his voice. "Can I go too?" To Sarah's surprise, Apache nodded, motioning for both boys to follow. He looked to Sarah, raising an eyebrow in question. "Yes," she said, understanding his silent request for permission. "But stay close to them." As they disappeared into the trees, Sarah busied herself gathering wood for a small fire. The night was cooler at this elevation, and Eli had been shivering in his sleep. Her hands worked automatically, her mind replaying the soldier's words. "You know what those savages do to white women." Yet here she was, entrusting her children to an Apache warrior without hesitation. How quickly certainties could dissolve when faced with lived truth. An hour passed before they returned. Thomas burst into the clearing first, his face alight with excitement. "Mama, we saw a deer, a real one!" Up close, Apache followed more slowly, Eli perched on his shoulders. The warrior carried something wrapped in his buckskin shirt. Sarah expected to see a rabbit or perhaps ground squirrels, smaller, easier prey. Instead, when he unwrapped the bundle, she saw herbs, roots, and wild onions. "You didn't kill the deer?" she asked. Thomas jumped in eagerly. "We were so close, Mama. Baeshi had his bow ready, but then we saw the deer had a hurt leg. It was old, too, had grey around its muzzle." Baeshi set Eli down and knelt to arrange the gathered plants. From his pouch he produced a bone needle and sinew thread. He pantomimed wrapping a wounded leg, then pointed in the direction they had come from. "He fixed the deer's leg instead of killing it," Eli explained proudly, as if he'd been part of the decision. Sarah looked at Baeshi with new eyes. "You could have had an easy kill. Your people believe in honoring the animals you hunt, but also in taking what's needed." The warrior held her gaze steadily. He made a gesture toward his heart, then toward the sky, then spread his palms in a way that suggested balance. "All life deserves respect," Thomas translated confidently. "Even when we must take it for food." Sarah nodded slowly, remembering how James had once shot a deer merely to prove his aim, leaving the meat to rot because he couldn't be bothered to carry it back to their wagon. He had laughed at her dismay. "My husband would have taken that shot," she said quietly. Wounded or not, Baeshi began preparing the wild foods he had gathered, his skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency. The children helped, following his silent instructions with growing competence. The meal was simple: roasted roots, wild onions, and a tea made from pine needles that tasted surprisingly sweet. Yet Sarah found it more satisfying than many elaborate dinners she had prepared back in Missouri. As they ate, Eli leaned comfortably against Baeshi's side, his small hand occasionally reaching up to touch the warrior's long hair. With fascination, Thomas sat cross-legged like a mirror image of the Apache, unconsciously adopting his posture and mannerisms. Sarah watched them, a strange mixture of emotions stirring in her chest. In just over a week, this silent man had become more of a father to her sons than James had been in years of marriage. When she finally caught Baeshi's eye across the fire, she offered him something she had almost forgotten she possessed: a genuine smile, small but true, free from fear or reservation. After a moment's surprise, the corners of his mouth lifted slightly in return, his normally stoic features softening in the firelight. In that silent exchange, something shifted between them, as subtle yet significant as the changing seasons. A thawing, a warming, a promise of growth. The air changed overnight. Sarah woke to an oppressive stillness, the sky above them a strange yellowish grey. Baeshi was already up, packing their few belongings with unusual haste, his movements sharp with urgency. "What's wrong?" she asked, quickly rousing the boys. He pointed to the southern horizon where dark clouds were building, then made a spiraling motion with his finger. His expression was grave enough that Sarah asked no further questions, hurrying the children. Onto the mustang. They rode harder than previous days, the warrior pushing their pace whenever the terrain allowed. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up, carrying fine particles of dust that stung their eyes and coated their skin. Thomas coughed, and Eli buried his face against Sarah's back. "A dust storm?" she asked, raising her voice above the growing wind. Baeshi nodded grimly. He pointed to a distant mesa, then to the sun, making a motion that suggested they needed to reach shelter before the storm hit in full force. As they rode, Sarah noticed stone markers appearing alongside their path, small cairns, carefully placed every 100 yards or so. Baeshi followed these without hesitation, clearly familiar with the route they indicated. The wind increased steadily, howling through the rock formations around them. Dust filled the air, reducing visibility to mere yards. Eli began to cry, frightened by the wailing wind and stinging sand. Even the normally stoic mustang tossed its head nervously, ears flattened against the rising gale. When they reached the base of the mesa, Sarah could barely see the path winding upward. Bei dismounted and took Eli from her arms, gesturing for them all to get down. The wind nearly knocked Sarah off her feet as soon as she stood. Thomas pressed against her, eyes squeezed shut against the swirling dust. Bei led the Mustang with one hand and carried Eli with the other, forging ahead along the barely visible trail. Sarah gripped Thomas's hand tightly as they struggled to follow. The world had narrowed to just the few feet of path before them and the dark shape of Bei-Shi's back. The climb seemed endless. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Thomas stumbled, and she barely caught him before he could fall. When her own strength began to fail, she felt a strong arm around her waist. Bei-Shi had returned, Eli now clinging to his back like a small monkey. The warrior half carried, half dragged her forward, his strength seemingly undiminished by the punishing conditions. Just when Sarah thought they could go no further, a dark opening appeared in the mesa wall, a crevice barely wide enough for them to pass through single file. Bei-Shi pushed them ahead of him, following last with the reluctant Mustang. The narrow passage twisted, then opened suddenly into a space so unexpected that Sarah gasped, despite her parched throat. They stood in an ancient stone dwelling built into the cliff face itself, a single room, with a smoke-blackened ceiling and small window openings that now whistled with the passing storm. "What is this place?" Thomas asked, voice hushed with wonder. Bei-Shi made a series of gestures indicating old people, many seasons past. "The Ancient Ones," Sarah translated, remembering stories she'd heard about the mysterious cliff dwellers who had inhabited these canyons long before either Apache or white settlers arrived. The stone shelter felt solid around them, a bulwark, against the howling storm outside. Bei-Shi lit a small fire in what remained of an ancient hearth, the smoke finding its way out through a cleverly designed vent in the ceiling. As they huddled near the warmth, still catching their breath, Sarah realized how close they had come to being lost in the storm. Without Bei-Shi's knowledge of this shelter's location, they might have perished. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes across the fire. "You saved us. Again." He shook his head slightly, pointing to each of them and then drawing a circle. In the air that included himself, together his gesture seemed to say, "We survived together." The storm raged outside, but within their stone haven, a different kind of warmth was growing. Eli had fallen asleep in Bei-Shi's lap, his small hand clutching the warrior's buckskin shirt. Thomas leaned against Sarah, his eyes growing heavy, despite the excitement of their shelter. As the day darkened toward evening, the close quarters of the ancient dwelling brought them physically nearer than they had yet been. Sarah found herself acutely aware of Bei-Shi's presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the subtle scent of sage and smoke that clung to him, the gentle way his hand rested protectively on Eli's back. When their eyes met briefly across the small space, she didn't look away. The mountains drew closer with each passing day. Sarah's body ached from riding, but she no longer flinched when Bei-Shi's arm brushed against hers. The children had adapted with the resilience of youth, Thomas eagerly absorbing the warrior's silent lessons about tracking and plants, Eli happily chattering to the painted Mustang as if it understood every word. On the 5th day, they crested a low rise and entered a sheltered valley. Sarah immediately sensed something wrong. Bei-Shi had gone rigid, his hand tightening on the Mustang's mane. The village below had been destroyed. Blackened teepee poles stood like skeletal fingers against the sky. Scattered possessions, a child's toy, a broken pot, a singed blanket, lay abandoned amid the ruins. No bodies remained, but charred patches of earth told their own terrible story. Bei-Shi dismounted slowly, helping them down with mechanical movements. His face had transformed into a mask of stone, but his eyes held a storm. He walked into the center of the destroyed village and knelt beside a fire pit where a single piece of charred wood still remained. He picked it up, cradling it in his palms like something precious. "What happened here?" Thomas whispered. "Soldiers," Sarah answered, the knowledge settling in her bones with dreadful certainty. She had heard whispers back in Missouri, stories of massacres justified as pacification. Baeshii moved through the ruins with reverence, occasionally touching an object or pausing before an empty dwelling. Sarah realized he was paying respects to those who had lived here, perhaps people he had known. Were these his people? "Mama?" Eli asked, clinging to her skirts. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. She watched as the warrior collected small stones, arranging them in patterns before certain dwellings. The sun was setting when he finally returned to them. Something had changed in his bearing, a new heaviness in his shoulders, yet also a resolution in his eyes. He reached inside his medicine pouch and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft hide. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a carved wooden figure, blackened on one side but still intact. A child's doll. With gentle movements, he placed it in Eli's small hands. "For me?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. Baeshii nodded once. Sarah's throat tightened. The warrior's gift wasn't just a toy, it was a piece of someone's life, salvaged from destruction. She thought of her own keepsakes from Missouri, abandoned in the overturned wagon. How quickly a life could be reduced to scattered remnants. They made camp at the edge of the ruined village, the mood somber. As darkness fell, Baeshii built a small fire and produced a pouch of something that looked like cornmeal. He mixed it with water in a salvaged pot and cooked a simple mush that tasted better than Sarah had expected. After the meal, he took out his knife and a small piece of wood. As they watched, his hands moved with practiced precision, carving what gradually took shape as a miniature horse. "Is it your mustang?" Thomas asked, pointing to the painted horse grazing nearby. Baeshii shook his head. He made a rocking motion with his hand, then pointed to Thomas. "A rocking horse?" Sarah suggested. "Like the one you had back home?" Thomas's face brightened. "You're making it for me?" The warrior nodded, continuing his careful work. Sarah watched his hands. Hands that had broken their chains, carried her sons across a raging river, and now created something beautiful from a piece of scorched wood. The same hands that had surely raised a weapon against white settlers like herself. "Why do the white men and the Apache fight?" Thomas asked suddenly, his young face troubled in the firelight. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. How? Could she explain generations of fear, greed, and misunderstanding? How could she justify either side when she sat beside the ashes of innocence? Baeshii paused in his carving, his dark eyes lifting to meet Sarah's. In that shared glance was a recognition. Two people from warring worlds, united in their inability to explain humanity's capacity for both compassion and cruelty to a child who deserved better answers. They left the ruined village at dawn, traveling higher into the foothills. The air grew cooler as they climbed, juniper and pinon giving way to ponderosa pine. By midday, Eli was flushed again, his earlier recovery seemingly undone by the trauma of the destroyed village. Sarah pressed her lips to his forehead, alarmed by the heat she felt there. "He's burning up again," she said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Baeshii studied the child with concern. He touched his own forehead, then Eli's, before nodding decisively and turning the mustang onto a barely visible trail that wound up a narrow canyon. The path grew steeper, forcing them to dismount and walk. Baeshii carried Eli, whose small head lolled against the warrior's shoulder. Sarah and Thomas followed, struggling over loose rocks and around thorny brush. Just when Sarah thought her legs would give out, they emerged into a hidden grotto. Spring bubbled from the rock face, filling a series of small, tiered pools before disappearing again underground. Ancient pictographs adorned the surrounding cliff walls. Spirals, handprints, and animal figures faded by centuries of weather. Baeshii set Eli down carefully by the uppermost pool. From a crevice in the rocks, he retrieved a clay bowl, so old that its patterns had nearly worn away. He dipped it into the water and offered it first to Eli, helping the boy drink. "It's sweet," Thomas said in surprise when his turn came. Sarah took the bowl with trembling hands. The water tasted of minerals and something else, something that reminded her of the willow bark tea her grandmother had made for fevers. She watched as Beshi gently lowered Eli into one of the lower pools, clothes and all. The boy gasped at the cool water, but didn't struggle. After a moment, his tense features relaxed. "It tingles, Mama," he said, wiggling his fingers in wonder. Sarah knelt beside the pool, touching the water. It did indeed seem to vibrate with a subtle energy. She looked questioningly at Beshi. He pointed to the pictographs, then to the spring, then made a sweeping gesture toward the sky. Sacred water, she understood. Healing water. "Thank you," she said, the words becoming easier each time she spoke them. As evening approached, Sarah bathed in one of the lower pools, the first proper washing she'd had since the attack. The water soothed her sunburned skin and eased the ache in her muscles. She unwound her hair from its tight bun, allowing it to float around her in the clear water. When she emerged, wrapped in the blanket Beshi had provided for privacy, she found him teaching Thomas to fish in the largest pool. The boy's face was alight with concentration as he held a makeshift spear poised above the water. "Look, Mama," he called. "I caught 2 already." 2 small trout lay on a flat rock nearby. Beshi was gutting a third with practiced movements, his knife flashing in the late afternoon light. That night, they feasted on fish roasted over a small fire. Eli ate with appetite for the first time in days, his fever noticeably reduced. Sarah felt her own strength returning as well, as if the spring had washed away more than just trail dust. As darkness fell, Beshi arranged their blankets beneath a natural overhang in the cliff face. The boys fell asleep almost immediately. Exhausted from the day's journey and the healing waters, Sarah sat by the dying fire, watching the stars appear one by one in the narrow strip of sky visible above the canyon. Beshi joined her, after a time, settling on the opposite side of the embers. In the faint glow, she could see him working on the wooden horse for Thomas, his hands moving with patient precision. "Your people consider this place sacred," she said softly. "It wasn't a question," he nodded, his eyes reflecting the last of the firelight. "My grandmother believed in healing waters," Sarah continued. "She was Cherokee, though my father forbade her to speak of it." The admission surprised her. She had told no one of her mixed heritage since leaving home at 17. Beshi paused in his carving, studying her face with new interest. Then, deliberately, he reached across the dying fire and placed his hand over hers for the briefest moment. That night, Sarah slept deeply for the first time since the attack. Her dreams, filled not with chains and bandits, but with sweet water and silent understanding. Night fell early, darkness thickened by the storm that continued to rage outside their stone sanctuary. The ancient dwelling creaked and whispered around them, but held firm against the howling wind. Their small fire cast dancing shadows across walls that had sheltered people for centuries. Eli woke from his nap, fretful and frightened by the storm's fury. "Make it stop, Mama," he pleaded, pressing his hands over his ears. "It will pass, little one," Sarah soothed, though her own nerves were frayed by the relentless sound. Beshi reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew something Sarah hadn't seen before. A small bone whistle, polished smooth by years of handling. He held it up, catching Eli's attention. "What is it?" the boy asked, momentarily distracted from his fear. The warrior put the whistle to his lips and blew gently. The sound that emerged was surprisingly rich and melodious, rising above the storm's chaos with a clear, sweet note. He played a simple pattern, 5 notes that rose and fell like a question and answer. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he began to hum. The sound was so unexpected that all 3 of them stared. After 7 days together, this was the first sound they had heard from his throat. The humming followed the same pattern as the whistle notes, forming a melody that somehow complemented the storm rather than competing with it. Thomas tilted his head, listening intently. After Beishii repeated the pattern several times, the boy tentatively began to hum along. The warrior nodded encouragement, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Soon Eli joined in, his childish voice rising and falling with the simple tune. Beishii handed the bone whistle to Thomas, showing him how to produce the notes. The boy was a quick study, and before long, the ancient dwelling was filled with their impromptu music. Thomas on the whistle, Eli and Beishii humming, the storm providing percussion. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked when they paused. "The song?" Beishii considered, then pointed to the solid walls around them, made a cradling motion with his arms, and finally placed his hand over his heart. "A protection song," Thomas interpreted confidently. "Like this place protects us from the storm." The warrior nodded, looking pleased with the boy's understanding. He motioned for Sarah to join them. "Oh, I don't sing," she demurred. James had always mocked her voice when she sang lullabies to the boys. Beishii simply waited, his expression patient but expectant. He began the humming again, Thomas and Eli joining in naturally. The harmony of their three voices, man, boy, and child, created a space that seemed to be waiting for her to fill. Hesitantly, Sarah added her voice to theirs. The melody was simple enough that she caught on quickly, her alto finding its place. Among their tones, something loosened in her chest as she sang, a tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since James's first harsh criticism years ago. As their voices blended in the ancient space, the storm's howling seemed to recede. Eli's eyes grew heavy again, his small body relaxing against Beishii's side. Thomas continued playing the whistle softly, his face serene in the firelight. A peculiar warmth filled the dwelling that had nothing to do with their small fire. Sarah felt it like a physical presence, wrapping around them protectively. Her grandmother had spoken of such things. The power of voices joined in sacred song, creating a shield against harmful spirits. She caught Beishii's eye across the fire and saw that he felt it too. His usually stoic face had softened, eyes reflecting both the flames and something deeper, a shared understanding that transcended their different worlds. When Thomas finally tired of playing and returned the whistle, Beishii surprised them again. He reached for Sarah's hand and placed the bone whistle in her palm, closing her fingers gently around it. "For me?" she asked, startled by the gift. He nodded, his hand lingering over hers for a moment longer than necessary. Through that simple touch, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of change, of boundaries crossed and new territories entered. As the children drifted to sleep, lulled by the now familiar rhythm of the storm, Sarah and Beishii sat awake in companionable silence. The bone whistle felt warm in her hand, like a living thing with its own pulse and memory. Without warning, tears sprang to her eyes, not tears of fear or grief, but of something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps, of how far she had traveled. From the woman who had once been chained to a wagon wheel waiting for death, Beishii watched a tear track down her cheek. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw, he reached out and caught it on his fingertip. The firelight gleamed on the small droplet, fragile and ephemeral, yet somehow significant in its brief existence, like life itself, Sarah thought, like all of us. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and eerily quiet. They descended from the mesa shelter at first light, Beishii leading the way with a vigilance that seemed heightened since their encounter with the soldiers. As they mounted the painted mustang, Sarah noticed him placing small, flat stones in particular formations near their path. Some balanced on edge, others arranged in patterns that would appear natural to untrained eyes. "What are those for?" Thomas asked, always observant. Beishii touched his eye, then pointed back along their trail, then made a motion like someone following. "To see if someone's following us?" the boy translated. The warrior nodded, his expression grave. Sarah felt a chill despite the morning sun. "The soldiers!" Beishii shrugged slightly. Perhaps not." He pointed to the stone markers. then drew his finger across one, showing how it would fall if disturbed. When they returned, they would know if anyone had passed this way. They traveled until midday, making good progress across terrain that grew increasingly forested. When they stopped to rest in a small clearing, Be'eshii knelt to examine something on the ground that Sarah couldn't see. His entire body went still, like a deer scenting danger. He motioned for silence, then gestured for Sarah and the boys to remain with the mustang while he scouted ahead. Sarah watched anxiously as he melted into the trees with barely a sound. "What did he see, Mama?" Eli whispered. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. Her hand went to the bone whistle hanging from a cord around her neck, drawing comfort from its smooth surface. Be'eshii returned within minutes, his expression taut. He quickly gathered several pine branches, sweeping away their tracks before leading them in a wide circle away from their original path. When they were a safe distance away, he drew in the dirt with a stick. 3 horses, 3 men. "Soldiers?" Sarah asked, her throat tight with fear. He shook his head, then drew a simple symbol she had seen on the bandits' saddlebags, the brand of a nearby ranch known for hiring men regardless of their past. "The men who attacked us," she breathed. "They're looking for us." Be'eshii nodded grimly. He pointed to the mustang's tracks, distinctive with one slightly malformed hoof. The bandits had recognized the prints, realized their victims might have survived. "But why follow us?" Thomas asked. "They already took everything we had." Sarah knew why. Witnesses. They couldn't risk being identified if she and the boys had survived to reach a settlement. And worse, the leader had looked at her in a way that made his other intentions clear, should they meet again. Be'eshii seemed to read her thoughts. His hand moved to his knife, his meaning unmistakable. He would kill to protect them if necessary. They continued at a faster pace, Be'eshii frequently doubling back to check for pursuit. At each pause, he placed his tracking stones, small, sentinels that would warn them if they were followed. "Can you teach me?" Thomas asked during one such stop, watching the warrior's precise placement. Be'eshii considered the boy for a moment, then nodded. He showed Thomas how to select the right stones, flat enough to balance, weathered enough to look natural. Together they placed several markers, the warrior correcting the boy's technique with patient hands. Sarah watched this lesson with mixed emotions. Her son was learning Apache ways, absorbing skills that might save his life in this harsh land. Yet each new connection to Be'eshii seemed to pull Thomas further from the future she had once envisioned for him. Educated, civilized, safely ensconced in a proper town. But what waited in those proper towns? Men like those who had murdered James and chained them to die. Men who looked at Indians and saw only savages to be eliminated. As evening approached, they made camp in a defensible position against a rock face, with clear views of the surrounding area. Be'eshii built only the smallest of fires, shielded to hide its light. They ate cold provisions, speaking little. When the boys finally slept, Sarah moved to sit beside Be'eshii, who kept watch at the edge of their camp. "What will we do if they find us?" she asked softly. He turned to meet her gaze, moonlight, silvering his strong features. With deliberate movements, he mimed creating a false trail, then circled his finger to indicate their true path would be hidden. "You've done this before," she observed. He nodded, a shadow crossing his face. Then, surprising her, he reached out and took her hand, turning it palm up. With his fingertip, he traced a path across her lifeline, then another path, branching away from it. "Choice," his gesture said. "There were always choices." "I've already chosen," Sarah said quietly, her fingers curling around his. "I trust you." His eyes held hers in the darkness, saying more than words ever could. With their hands still joined, they listened together to the night sounds, alert for any disturbance that might signal danger approaching their small, fragile sanctuary. Dawn found them already moving, following a narrow game trail that wound ever deeper into the mountains. Be'eshii had checked his tracking stones before first light. 2 had been disturbed. The pursuit continued. They rode in tense silence, the mustang picking its way carefully through increasingly rugged terrain. Twice, Beshi led them through shallow streams, walking the horse upstream to hide their tracks. By midday, they reached what appeared to be a sheer cliff face, covered with dense brush. Dismounting, Beshi moved confidently to a particular section of wall and began pushing aside the thick vegetation. To Sarah's amazement, a narrow passage appeared, invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. The warrior helped them dismount, then led the mustang into the hidden path. They followed single file, the walls so close that Sarah's skirts brushed both sides. The passage twisted sharply, then descended through a series of switchbacks before finally opening onto a sight so unexpected that all three of them gasped aloud. Before them lay a hidden valley, sheltered on all sides by steep cliffs. A clear stream meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers. Stands of pine and aspen provided shade, while terraced gardens grew on the southern slope. Near the valley floor stood several traditional Apache wickiups, with smoke rising lazily from cooking fires. At the entrance to the valley, large stones had been arranged in a semicircle, guardians protecting the secret paradise beyond. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, scarcely believing such a place could exist. Beshi nodded, a rare smile softening his features. "Home," his expression seemed to say. As they descended toward the settlement, a figure emerged from the largest wickiup, an elderly woman with silver hair braided with turquoise beads. She walked with the aid of a gnarled wooden staff, but held herself proudly. "You have returned, Beshi," she called in clear, if accented, English, "and you have brought them as the vision showed." Sarah nearly stumbled in shock at hearing spoken words directed to the silent warrior. The old woman's eyes, black and sharp as obsidian, turned to study her and the boys. "I am Nasha," she continued, switching her gaze between them, "sister to Beeshi's mother, who walks now in the spirit lands. In your tongue, my name means owl." She gestured toward her dwelling. "Come, you are weary from your journey." Inside the wickiup, the air was fragrant with herbs hanging from the ceiling. Nasha motioned for them to sit on woven mats around a small central fire. She studied them openly, her ancient face unreadable. "You have questions," she stated rather than asked. "Many questions." "You speak English," Sarah said, still recovering from her surprise. "I was taken to the mission school as a child." A shadow passed across Nasha's face. "They believed they could erase the Apache from me. They were wrong." She turned to Beshi, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. He responded with gestures and expressions, their communication fluid despite his silence. "He has told me of your journey," Nasha said, turning back to Sarah. "Of the men who hunt you. You will be safe here. You know of this valley, and those who do would never betray its location." "How did he find us?" Sarah asked. "Why did he help us?" The old woman's eyes crinkled. "The eagle spirit led him. 7 days before he found you, Beshi had a vision while fasting on the sacred mountain. He saw a woman and 2 children chained to a wheel, their spirits calling out. The eagle told him he must carry you to safety." Sarah glanced at Beshi, who was watching her reaction carefully. "A vision," she repeated, unsure what to think. "You doubt," Nasha said. "That is natural. Yet here you sit, alive instead of dead beneath the desert sun." She leaned forward. "There is more. Beshi was not sent merely to save your bodies, but for a greater purpose. The eagle spirit has long prophesied one who would bridge our worlds, a child of both blood and spirit." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "You will." Nasha's gaze shifted to Thomas, who was examining a decorated medicine bag with fascination. "The boy already begins to see with double vision, the white man's way and ours together." Beshi made a series of gestures to the old woman, his expression urgent. "Yes," she responded aloud. "I will tell her." She fixed Sarah with those penetrating eyes. "There is something else you should know about Beshi. Sarah's heart quickened inexplicably. What is it? The man you know as Apache was not always silent. Before the soldiers killed his wife and daughter, at Skeleton Canyon, he was known by another name among the white men. Nasha paused, her gaze steady. They called him Benjamin Davis. His father was a cavalry officer, his mother Apache. He walked in both worlds until grief buried his words. Sarah stared at Apache, Benjamin, with new understanding flooding through her. His silent competence in both worlds, his careful guidance, his compassion for her family when others of his tribe might have seen only enemies. "You're like me," she whispered, "between worlds." Days passed with a gentleness Sarah hadn't known since childhood. The hidden valley cradled them in its peace, the small Apache community accepting them with quiet dignity. The boys thrived, running freely with the few Apache children, returning. Each evening, sun-browned and full of new words and discoveries, Sarah found herself drawn to the women's activities, grinding corn, weaving baskets, tending the terraced gardens. Her hands, once soft with town living, grew calloused and capable. At night she often sat with Nasha, learning the old healing ways that reminded her of her grandmother's forgotten teachings. Benjamin, was a constant presence, though not an intrusive one. He taught Thomas to track and hunt with a small bow fashioned to fit the boy's height. He carried Eli on his shoulders to gather eagle feathers from the high cliffs. And sometimes, when the children were occupied elsewhere, he simply sat near. Sarah as she worked, his silence no longer a barrier but a shared language. On the 7th day in the valley, Nasha approached Sarah as she tended the garden. "Walk with me," the old woman said, leaning on her staff. "There is something you should see." They followed a path that climbed the eastern slope, eventually reaching a flat stone that jutted from the mountainside. Two distinct trails diverged. From this point, one continuing up into the mountains, the other descending toward the distant plains. "The two-path stone," Nasha explained. "For generations, our people have come here to make difficult choices." She pointed to the eastern trail. "That path leads eventually to the white settlements. Fort Defiance lies 4 days' journey in that direction." Sarah's heart quickened. "And the other path?" "To the high country, where our cousins the White Mountain Apache have their summer camps. Beyond that, the sacred mountains where few travel." The old woman lowered herself carefully onto the stone, patting the space beside her. When Sarah sat, Nasha continued. "Early this morning, Apache went to check the trails. He found signs of the blue coats, a patrol searching these mountains." Her weathered face was grave. "They camp now just half a day's ride from the eastern entrance to our valley." "They're looking for us," Sarah said, certainty settling in her stomach like a stone. Nasha nodded. "The bandits who pursue you have spoken in the settlements of a woman and children stolen by an Apache. Some believe this tale. Others remember the bandits' reputation and doubt. The bluecoats search to learn the truth." "What should we do?" Sarah asked, though something in her already knew what was coming. "That is for you to decide." Nasha's black eyes held hers steadily. "The two-path. Stone offers choices, not answers. You could take your children to the fort, tell your story. Perhaps they would believe you. Perhaps they would return you to your own kind. And Benjamin, he would not be welcome among the white soldiers. They see only Apache." The old woman sighed. "And if they learned he had taken a white woman and her children?" The implication hung in the air between them. In the eyes of the army, Apache would be seen as a kidnapper at best, deserving of imprisonment or death. "That's not fair," Sarah protested. "He saved us." "Fairness is a luxury in these times," Nasha replied. "You must choose the path that will protect your children." Sarah gazed out over the valley, where Thomas was visible, learning to throw a small spear under Benjamin's patient guidance. Eli sat nearby, playing contentedly with the wooden doll he'd been given. They looked happy, healthy, flourishing in a way they never had under James's harsh rule. "My husband," Sarah said slowly, believed that Indians were savages who could never be civilized. He would beat Thomas for asking questions about them. She touched the faded bruise on her own wrist, a parting gift from James before the bandits had attacked. He wasn't a kind man, Nasha nodded, unsurprised. And now you have seen another way of living. Yes, Sarah's hand went to the bone whistle she still wore around her neck. But I was raised to believe certain truths, that white ways are superior, that Indians are... She couldn't finish, ashamed now of beliefs she had once taken for granted. Each path has its cost, Nasha said gently. The question is which price you can bear to pay. As if summoned by their conversation, Benjamin appeared on the trail below, his eyes finding Sarah immediately. Even at a distance she could read the concern in his posture. He will not influence your choice, Nasha said, following her gaze. It is not our way to cage another's spirit. He will accept whatever path you choose for yourself and your children. Sarah watched as Benjamin started up the trail toward them, his movements as graceful and sure as the day he had first appeared. To break their chains, I need to think, she said quietly. Nasha patted her hand. The two-path stone has witnessed many troubled hearts. Sit with it a while. It will hold your weight while you decide. Sarah remained at the two-path stone long after Nasha had returned to the valley. When Benjamin finally reached her, he sat without presumption, leaving space between them on the ancient stone. I need time, she said quietly, to decide what's best for my boys. He nodded, his expression showing no judgment, only understanding. After a moment, he reached into his pouch and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed, creased, but carefully preserved. He handed it to her with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. It was a photograph, faded but still clear. A young Benjamin in the formal attire of an army interpreter, standing beside a beautiful Apache woman holding an infant. His family before Skeleton Canyon, before silence. Thank you, Sarah whispered, understanding the profound trust in sharing this piece of his past. For showing me. He took the photograph back carefully, returning it to his pouch. Then, with deliberate movements, he pointed to her, then to the boys visible in the valley below, then placed his hand over his heart. Whatever you choose, the gesture said, I respect your decision. They walked back together as the sun began its descent, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself drawn to the women's work areas more frequently. An elderly woman named Casa showed her the intricate Apache weaving techniques, guiding Sarah's hands on a small loom. The repetitive motion of weaving thread across thread became almost meditative, allowing her mind to work through the choice that loomed before her. The boys made their preferences clear without being asked. Can we stay forever, Mama? Eli had questioned one night as she tucked him into the soft furs that now served as his bed. Thomas, more perceptive, watched her, with worried eyes whenever talk of the soldiers arose. We belong here now, he had said with the simple certainty of childhood while helping her gather herbs for Nasha's medicines. But belonging was complicated, Sarah knew. What awaited them if they returned to white society? As a widow with 2 young sons, her options would be limited, remarriage perhaps to a man like James, or struggling alone on the margins of proper society. The thought made her shoulders tense with remembered constraints, yet here in the valley she had found unexpected freedom. The Apache women worked alongside their men, their wisdom respected, their voices heard in council. Children were raised with gentle guidance rather than harsh discipline. And Benjamin, she watched him across the central fire one evening, showing Thomas how to repair a bowstring. His hands moved with patient skill, his face animated in a way she had rarely seen, as he responded to the boys' questions with expressive gestures. He had become more than a protector to them. He was a teacher, a guide, perhaps even... Sarah turned away, her cheeks warming at the direction of her thoughts. The next morning, she found Benjamin preparing for a hunting trip, checking his bow. "And arrows with methodical care. May I come with you?" she asked impulsively. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something warmer. He nodded, pointing to the sun and making a small arc. They would return by midday. They left the boys in Nash's capable care and set out along a game trail that wound up into the pine forest above the valley. Benjamin moved with silent efficiency, pausing occasionally to point out tracks or medicinal plants. Sarah followed, absorbing his silent lessons with growing confidence. In a small clearing, he suddenly raised his hand for stillness. Ahead, a young deer grazed peacefully, unaware of their presence. Benjamin nocked an arrow but made no move to shoot. Instead, he guided Sarah's hands to his bow, positioning her fingers correctly. His chest pressed lightly against her back as he helped her draw the string. His breath stirred the hair near her ear, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the strength in his arms as they supported hers. The deer bounded away, startled by some small sound, but Sarah barely noticed. She turned within the circle of Benjamin's arms, the bow forgotten between them. Their faces were inches apart, his eyes questioning. Slowly, giving him time to withdraw, she raised her hand to his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the slight roughness of stubble, a fascinating texture. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability that caught at her heart. For a breathless moment they remained thus, poised on the edge of something profound. Then, with exquisite gentleness, Benjamin covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press his lips against her palm. The gesture held a tenderness that words, spoken or unspoken, could never have conveyed. They returned to the valley in a state of heightened awareness, not just of their surroundings, but of each other. Something fundamental had shifted between them, acknowledged but not yet fully explored. Benjamin's hand occasionally brushed hers as they walked, each brief contact sending warmth through Sarah's entire body. The peace was shattered the moment they entered the settlement. Nasha hurried toward them, her normally composed face taut with concern. "The soldiers," she said without preamble. "They have found the eastern entrance. Tarek spotted them while gathering herbs." Benjamin's posture changed instantly. Tension, replacing the relaxed companionship of moments before. He made rapid signs to Nasha, who nodded grimly. "He asks if they have entered the valley," she translated for Sarah. "Not yet, but they will. They follow tracks left by hunters returning." "Yesterday." Sarah's hand went to her throat, where her silver locket, the only keepsake from her previous life, hung beside the bone whistle. Inside the locket was a small portrait of James, painted in happier days before bitterness had hardened him. Her, past and present, hanging side by side. "How many?" she asked. "6 mounted men," Nasha replied. "A small patrol, not a war party. They call out a woman's name." "Mine," Sarah whispered. "They're looking for me." Benjamin took her arm gently, guiding her toward Nasha's wickiup, where the boys were being kept out of sight. Thomas jumped up. When they entered, his young face serious. "Are the soldiers coming for us, Mama?" he asked. Eli looked up from where he sat playing with his wooden doll, eyes wide with confusion. "Yes," Sarah answered honestly, "but you don't need to be afraid." Though her own heart raced with uncertainty, she kept her voice steady for her sons. Benjamin knelt before the boys, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. His expression was solemn but reassuring. He pointed to himself, then made a protective gesture that encircled them all. "He'll keep us safe," Thomas translated, though the meaning had been clear even without words. The next hour passed in tense preparation. The few Apache families gathered their most important possessions, ready to retreat to higher hiding places if necessary. Benjamin conferred with the men, organizing a defensive watch. Sarah sat with Nasha, the boys pressed close on either side. "You must decide now," the old woman said quietly, "before they arrive." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The choice that had seemed so complex at the two-path stone, now crystallized with the immediacy of danger. If she stepped forward, identified herself to the soldiers, she could prevent violence. She could return her sons to the white world, to education and opportunity, and Benjamin would face accusation, imprisonment, perhaps worse. If she hid, remained with the Apache, the soldiers might eventually leave, or they might not. They might search, grow suspicious, return with more men. The peaceful valley would never be truly safe again. The sound of approaching horses reached them before any decision could be voiced. Benjamin slipped into the wickiup, his face grave. He gestured. Urgently, the soldiers had entered the valley's central clearing. "We need to see," Sarah said, rising, "before I decide." Benjamin hesitated, then nodded. They crept to a position behind the largest wickiup, where they could observe without being seen. 6 mounted soldiers surveyed the settlement, rifles ready, but not yet aimed. Their sergeant, a weathered man with a grey-streaked beard, called out, "Mrs. Holcomb, Sarah Holcomb, are you here? We've come to bring you home." Sarah's breath caught. How strange to hear her name called by a stranger after so many days of being simply herself. "We tracked those bandits who attacked your wagon," the sergeant continued. "Found what was left of your husband. Been searching for you and your boys since. If you're being held against your will, we'll get you out safely." The Apache remained invisible, watching from concealed positions. Benjamin's hand found Sarah's, squeezing gently, support without pressure. "Mrs. Holcomb," the sergeant called again, "if anyone here knows of a white woman and 2 boys, there's a reward for information." Sarah looked down at the silver locket, around her neck, the last link to her former life. With trembling fingers, she opened it, gazing at James's painted face. Then she turned to Benjamin, whose dark eyes held nothing but acceptance of whatever she would choose. Slowly she removed the locket, closing it with a soft click that sounded like a door shutting. She placed it in her pocket, leaving only the bone whistle against her skin. "Take the boys deeper into the wickiup," she whispered to Nasha. "Keep them quiet." Benjamin's eyes widened as he realized her intention. He gripped her arm, shaking. His head urgently. "I have to," she said softly, "or they'll never stop looking." His face reflected anguish, the first time she had seen his stoic mask truly break. With desperate movements, he tried to communicate something vital. "I know," she said, touching his cheek gently. "I know the risk, but I've made my choice." Sarah stepped into the clearing with steady purpose, head held high. The soldiers' hands moved immediately to their weapons, but the sergeant raised his palm, staying their reaction. "Mrs. Holcomb?" he asked, eyes narrowing with cautious hope. "Yes," she answered clearly. "I am Sarah Holcomb." Relief washed across the sergeant's weathered face. "Thank the Lord. We've been searching for weeks. Your boys, are they—" "My sons are alive and well," she interrupted. "As am I." The sergeant dismounted, approaching slowly, as if afraid she might startle. "We're here to take you home, ma'am, back to Fort Defiance. There's a settlement of families there, women who can help you recover from your ordeal." Sarah didn't move. "There has been no ordeal, Sergeant, except the one inflicted by the bandits who killed my husband and left us to die." She took a deep breath. "I was rescued by an Apache man who broke our chains and carried my children to safety. He has treated us with nothing but kindness and respect." Confusion clouded the sergeant's expression. "An Apache? Ma'am, are you saying you're here willingly?" "I am." The soldiers exchanged glances, hands still near their weapons. The sergeant cleared his throat, uncomfortably. "Mrs. Holcomb, sometimes captives develop confused feelings toward their captors. It's not uncommon." "I was never a captive," Sarah said firmly. At that moment, Thomas and Eli darted from the wickiup, ignoring Nasha's attempts to hold them back. They ran to their mother's side, eyes wide but unafraid as they regarded the soldiers. "These men have come to take us back to the fort," Sarah explained gently to her sons. "But we live here now," Eli protested loudly. Thomas studied the soldiers with a maturity beyond his years. She saved us when no one else would. We belong here. The sergeant's brow furrowed deeper. Ma'am, no white child belongs among... He is not just Apache, came a deep voice from behind them. Benjamin stepped forward, his first spoken words in 7 years, resonating with quiet authority. She is not just white. The soldiers raised their rifles instinctively, but the sergeant held up his hand again, recognition dawning in his eyes. Davis? Benjamin Davis? We thought you were dead after Skeleton Canyon. Part of me was, Benjamin answered, his voice rough from disuse. But I am Be'eshii as well, as these children are both of their worlds. He moved to stand beside Sarah, their shoulders touching. She is free to choose, he continued, each word measured and deliberate, as are her sons. Sarah reached for Benjamin's hand, twining her fingers with his. I've made my choice, Sergeant. My children and I are staying. The sergeant looked between them, understanding slowly dawning. The army has no quarrel with peaceful Apache, he said finally. And if you're here by choice... He hesitated, then nodded. I'll report that we found no trace of you, that the bandit's story was false. As the soldiers prepared to depart, Sarah and Benjamin stood side by side at the center of the valley, their children before them. Beneath their feet lay an ancient stone, half buried in the earth, its surface worn smooth by countless generations, its natural curve forming a bridge between two sides of the stream that fed the valley's heart. 2 worlds, no longer divided, but connected by the strongest bridge of all, love born in silence, proven through actions, and finally given voice.